We're now joined by Allison Minor, who's the director of the Project for Middle East Integration with the Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Center and Middle East Program. She previously served as U.S. Deputy Special Envoy for Yemen and as Director for Arabian Peninsula Affairs at the National Security Council. Thank you very much for speaking with us here on Times Now. Given Iran's strategy of widening the conflict across the Gulf and using drones and proxies and economic disruption, do you see this war evolving into a prolonged regional conflict rather than a short punitive campaign?
It's difficult to say. I think the first question is how long will U.S. operations continue? And that's a difficult question to answer with this administration. We've seen them shifting their objectives thus far. I think it is quite possible that the administration concludes its operation suddenly in the same way that we saw them do in early 2025 against their campaign against the Houthis. But it's not clear whether or not Iran will actually stop its operations after the U.S. does, or if Israel will. I think Israel has been very clear about its objectives for regime change, and they may seek to continue those operations after the U.S. departs. Iran, on the other hand, may have its own reasons to continue operations as it seeks to exact some sort of demands from its neighbors to help it recover from these attacks. So I think it's going to be interesting to see to watch all of those players in the weeks to come.
Right. You know, your article suggests that the Gulf that emerges from this conflict is going to look very different. Do you see Gulf states moving towards deeper security integration with the United States and Israel? Or could this war actually push them to rethink their dependence on Washington?
I think there are multiple ways that the Gulf countries could go from here. And the big question that they will be asking is whether or not the U.S. is willing to come to their defense, both in the immediate term as they seek to defend against Iranian attacks, and in the longer term, whether the United States will provide stronger security guarantees now that the Gulf security threat posture is so heightened. If the U.S. is willing to provide that kind of support, we could see stronger U.S. Gulf military integration going forward as Gulf countries have registered that Iran is, in fact, their greatest threat. Alternatively, if the U.S. is not capable of providing that support, we could see the Gulf countries seeking other options. And that could include continued dialogue and de-escalation with Iran, as we saw the Gulf countries do, especially after 2019. But the Iranian regime demands for that de-escalation could be quite higher now.
Washington's messaging has appeared inconsistent, sometimes hinting at degrading Iran's capabilities, then sometimes suggesting regime-level change. From your reading of the situation, does the United States actually have a clearly defined end state for this war? And how does this ambiguity affect allies like Saudi Arabia and the UAE who are trying to plan their own responses?
It's a good question. The United States released objectives on March 3rd, so after President Trump's initial message about the campaign. And these objectives fell short of regime change. They said that they wanted to destroy Iran's navy, destroy their missile industry and missile arsenal, to stop proxies, Iranian proxies, from destabilizing the region and prevent Iran from ever having a nuclear weapon. The U.S. seems to be operating under these objectives currently. We've seen them take significant action against the Iranian Navy, and according to the U.S. government, they have taken out that Navy and similar significant campaigns against Iranian missiles. The second two objectives, addressing the proxies and Iran's nuclear capabilities, will be much harder to accomplish simply with an air campaign. And so I think we could see these objectives continue to shift in the coming days. And you're very right that this makes it very hard for U.S. allies to know how to respond. I think that lack of clear messaging is going to be particularly concerning for the Gulf countries as they're mulling this question about how to address the Iranian threat.
Okay. Now, Iran has responded not only against Israel and U.S. assets, but also with strikes across Gulf states and regional infrastructure. Is this Iran's deliberate strategy to regionalize the conflict and raise the cost for Washington and its partners? And how effective has this strategy been so far, in your opinion?
Iran clearly sees this conflict as existential, so they are deploying very intensive attacks against Gulf countries, as you've said. We've actually seen Gulf countries getting more attacks now than Israel itself, who is part of these operations, particularly against the UAE. I think that Iran's strategy is likely to try to pressure the Gulf states to press the U.S. to stop their campaign. But so far that is not working. And in fact, the Gulf states seem to be rallying. And as we've heard senior Emirati officials say, be reminded that Iran is, in fact, their greatest threat. I think it is interesting that we've seen some degree of restraint from Iran. They have not yet attacked desalination plants in the Gulf, which are an existential issue for Gulf countries who are heavily water dependent and need these desalination plants. This could be a sign that Iran is still calibrating its attacks to help prevent Gulf countries from actually getting involved militarily in the conflict. But we've also seen Iranian attacks outside of the Gulf and immediate Middle East region with reported attacks on both Azerbaijan and on Turkey. So I think this is a sign that the longer the conflict goes on, the more it will spread.
Okay, the sinking of Iranian warship near Sri Lanka marks a major geographic expansion of the conflict beyond the traditional Middle Eastern theater. What are the strategic implications of this spillover into the Indian Ocean, especially for countries like India that rely heavily on these sea lanes?
The U.S. attack seems to be part of their objective, as I noted, to annihilate the Iranian Navy. I hope that there won't be further significant attacks in our operations in South Asia. But again, this is an indication of how the conflict is prone to spread. I think the bigger concern for India is the disruption to trade with the Gulf states and disruption, as you note, to those shipping lanes. I think that we could see Iran continue to attempt to disrupt maritime shipping, not just in the Strait of Hormuz, but more broadly. We saw this with the Houthis as their campaign against commercial shipping in the Red Sea continued over the course of 2023 to 2025. We saw them attempting to extend their attacks into the Indian Ocean. So Iran, with its greater capabilities, I would assume would do the same.
Okay. Now, with Iran's leadership severely disrupted and pressure mounting from both external strikes and internal dissent, do you see regime change becoming an implicit objective of the U.S.-Israel campaign? Or is Washington still cautious about openly pursuing that outcome?
I think we've seen in the past few days that the Iranian regime is perhaps more resilient than the Trump administration thought it might be. It is very difficult to topple a regime, especially one as deeply rooted and with strong institutions like Iran's, with an air campaign alone. So we've actually seen the U.S. revise its stated objectives and stop referring directly to regime change. I also think that it is very difficult to topple regimes of this nature in the short term. They may be deeply weakened, but those regimes can hold on for a remarkably long period of time. And I think Syria has provided us this example with the Assad regime. Even though it was fundamentally weakened and on the verge of collapse, it took over a decade for that collapse to actually occur.
Okay. Now, so far, the campaign appears focused on air and naval power. But if Iran continues asymmetric retaliation across the region, is there any realistic scenario in which the United States or its allies would consider deploying ground forces?
Again, it's very hard to determine what this U.S. administration might do. But given Trump's prior stance against long wars in the Middle East and domestic political opinion here, which is not supportive of the war broadly, I think that it's unlikely. What we are seeing signs of now is that the U.S. may be seeking to use Kurdish factions from Iraq to conduct operations inside Iran, which again creates its own range of risks. But we'll see in the coming days how this might evolve.
Okay. Now, from Israel's perspective, is the primary goal to permanently dismantle Iran's military and proxy network, or simply to push Tehran's strategic capabilities, missiles, drones, nuclear ambitions far enough back to buy several years of security?
Israel seems to be seeking to topple the regime and eliminate any of their attack capabilities. I think that in the wake of October 7th, Israelis do see this as an existential issue and see this as their opportunity. I think they would have taken the 12-day war from the last summer further if they had the option. So I think that they will push this as far as they can. And the real question is how the U.S. responds to that Israeli push.
Now, Israel has also launched a 26-strike assault in Hezbollah strongholds in Lebanon, effectively opening another active front. Yesterday, Emmanuel Macron said that for Lebanon, we must act. How do you see this front? Do you see a full-scale ground invasion of Lebanon by Israel as a possibility?
I think it's possible. Again, the Israelis have sought to eliminate Hezbollah as a threat altogether, and seeing Hezbollah launch even minor attacks in support of Iran after this latest campaign is a reminder to Israelis that the threat still remains. And while we've seen some progress inside of Lebanon towards lessening Hezbollah's hold over the country and over its government, that progress has not been as far as the U.S. or Israel would like it to see. So we are likely to see continued Israeli operations in Lebanon. And I think the real question is, can those be contained in a way where we don't see widespread humanitarian crisis and further tensions on this Lebanese government that is really trying to emerge out of a very difficult economic crisis and political crisis that it's been suffering from for years now.
Okay. Now, President Donald Trump has openly encouraged Iranian Kurdish groups to attack Iran. In fact, is this an attempt, in your opinion, by Washington to trigger internal destabilization inside Iran? And could that dramatically escalate the conflict beyond conventional warfare?
It does appear to be adding a whole new aspect to the conflict. And I think the real risk here is that you start to see a civil conflict breaking out in Iran, in addition to the regional conflict that we've seen. I'll defer to other Iran experts to speak to some of the internal issues inside of Iran and how these could be triggered. But I think it is a very concerning new aspect to the conflict that we'll have to watch in coming days.
Now, the U.S. Senate has rejected a resolution that could have limited the president's war powers in Iran. Does this effectively give the White House a free hand to continue military operations? And what does it signal about political support for the war in Washington?
I think it is a sign that the Republican Party is still giving President Trump time to continue to execute this operation. If you look at polling within the United States, while 60% of Americans do not support the war, there is still support among the Republican Party and President Trump's base. So I think this is a sign that he has time, but Republicans could sour on this. There is a strong opposition to foreign wars, especially foreign wars in the Middle East within the Republican Party. So this is certainly trying President Trump's coalition. I think it's noteworthy to note, though, that even if Republicans do join in and support a war powers resolution in Congress, President Trump could still veto it, and it would not be the first time. We saw a similar war powers resolution passed in Congress in 2019, then in response to U.S. support for operations inside of Yemen, and President Trump vetoed it and continued that support.
Okay. Now, the U.S. has given India a 30-day waiver to purchase stranded Russian oil as war disrupts energy markets. Do you think the conflict could significantly reshape global oil trade and push countries like India into more complex geopolitical balancing?
I'll defer to experts on the oil markets to provide predictions of just how this could shape what are very complex markets, but it certainly is going to remind countries of the importance of diversification. But the fact is that there are these global maritime choke points, including the Strait of Hormuz, including Bab el-Mandeb, which the Houthis have sought to restrict before, have not yet again activated during this campaign, but we could see that in the coming weeks. So I think this is a reminder that diversification is essential, but ultimately, if we are relying especially on oil and gas, there are only so many routes that those can pass through.
All right, we leave it there. Allison Minor, appreciate you joining us here on Times Now and sharing with us your perspective.